She bit into it and stopped breathing. Not from fear, from memory. The sweetness hit her tongue first. Cinnamon, butter, vanilla, caramelized sugar melting into soft dough. And suddenly she was not standing in an American prison camp kitchen in Alabama. She was in Bavaria, 8 years old. Her grandmother's hands kneading dough in the Sunday morning light. The smell of Zimtschnecken filling the small kitchen. Safety, warmth, a world that no longer existed, a world that...
I haven't tasted sugar in years,
Margareta Hoffman whispered in German, tears streaming down her face.
Real sugar, like this.
She was 27 years old. She had spent 3 years baking bread for the Wehrmacht. She had believed she was serving her country. Now she stood in an enemy kitchen, crying over a cinnamon roll, while an American sergeant watched in silence. But that moment was still 3 weeks away. This story begins in darkness, in a ship's hold crossing the Atlantic, with 34 German women who had no idea what awaited them. March 15th, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final desperate weeks. The women crowded into the cargo hold of the transport ship did not know this yet. They knew only hunger, exhaustion, the bitter taste of defeat that no amount of seawater could wash away. The hold smelled of rust and diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. 34 women pressed together in a space designed for cargo, not humans. They sat on wooden benches bolted to the metal walls. They slept in shifts on thin blankets spread across the floor. They had been sailing for 6 days. They had 11 more to go. Margareta Hoffman pressed her back against the cold metal wall and studied her hands. They told the story of who she had been. Baker's hands. Calloused palms from years of kneading dough. Fingertips roughened by contact with hot ovens. But now those hands were cracked, dry, the knuckles split and bleeding from months without proper care. She had not touched flour since October. She had not created anything since her unit was overrun near the Belgian border. 5'6", 98 pounds. She had weighed 132 pounds when the war began. 34 pounds had disappeared over 4 years. Not all at once, gradually, a pound here, 2 pounds there. The slow erosion of a body denied proper nutrition. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. Her cheekbones jutted sharp beneath skin that had lost its color. Her hair, once thick and brown, had thinned until she could see her scalp when she looked in the small mirror the guards allowed them. BMI of 15.8, moderate malnutrition. She did not know these clinical terms. She knew only that she was always cold, always tired, always hungry in a way that had become so constant she had forgotten what satisfaction felt like. Around her in the dim hold, the other women existed in various states of deterioration. Brigitte Lehrmann sat beside her on the bench. They called her Gitta. 22 years old, a radio operator whose fingers had once danced across telegraph keys with precision that earned commendations from her superiors. Now those same fingers picked nervously at the frayed hem of her grey auxiliary uniform. 5'4", 89 pounds, BMI of 15.3. Her blonde hair had gone dull from 8 months without proper washing. Her eyes, which had been bright blue in the photograph she carried from before the war, had faded to something closer to grey. She rarely spoke anymore. She had stopped speaking much after Dresden. Her younger sister Anneliese had been in Dresden. Gitta did not know if Anneliese was alive or dead. The bombing had happened on February 13th, 1945, 1 month ago. The firestorm had killed somewhere between 25,000 and 135,000 people. No one knew the real number. Communication with Dresden had been impossible since the attack. Gitta had written 3 letters. None had been answered, none had been returned. They had simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing nation. She was 22 years old, and she had stopped hoping. Across the hold, Liesel Falkenberg sat with her knees pulled to her chest. 19 years old, an administrative clerk from Cologne who had never expected to see combat, never expected to be captured, never expected to find herself on a ship bound for America. She was the youngest among them. She cried the most. The other women had stopped comforting her because comfort required energy none of them possessed. They simply let her cry and hoped she would eventually exhaust herself into silence. Near the back of the hold, Hildegard Reinhardt tended to a woman running a fever. They called her Hilda, 31 years old, a senior nurse who had spent the final months before capture working in field hospitals where the wounded outnumbered the supplies 10-1. She had learned to perform triage with nothing but intuition and desperation. Now she worked with only water and torn cloth, trying to bring comfort where she could provide no real treatment. And then there was Gerda Kettner, 31 years old, a supply officer who had managed logistics for units across occupied France. She sat apart from the others, her back rigid against the metal wall, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only she could see. She had been beautiful once, dark hair, strong features, the kind of presence that commanded attention when she entered a room. Now her beauty had hardened into something else. Her cheekbones were too sharp. Her eyes held a coldness that made the other women uncomfortable. In her pocket, she carried a letter. She had read it so many times the paper had worn thin at the creases. The words had blurred in places where her tears had fallen. But she had memorized every line long ago. The letter was from her husband, Werner. Hauptmann Werner Kettner. He had written it in January 1943 from somewhere outside Stalingrad. It was the last letter she ever received from him. "We will win," he had written, "for Germany, for our future, for the children we will have when this is over. I carry your photograph against my heart. I think of you every night before I sleep. We will win, my love. We must." Werner had died in the Soviet encirclement of Stalingrad. 91,000 German soldiers surrendered. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. Werner was not among them. Gerda had received the official notification in March 1943. 2 years ago, she had not cried. She had folded the notification and placed it in her desk drawer and returned to work. She had continued managing supply lines. She had continued serving the Reich. Because if she stopped, if she allowed herself to feel, she would have to acknowledge that Werner had died for nothing. She could not acknowledge that. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The ship groaned as it crested another wave. The women swayed with the motion. Some had stopped eating because their stomachs could not handle the constant rolling. The rations provided by the American crew were minimal. 1,100 calories per day, enough to sustain life, not enough to restore health. According to records later preserved at the National Archives, German civilian rations had dropped from 2,000 calories in 1939 to 1,200 calories by late 1944 and as low as 800 calories in some regions by March 1945. Sugar had vanished entirely from civilian markets by mid-1942. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember the last real meal she had eaten. Christmas, 1944. A military bakery in Liège. The commanding officer had somehow obtained a goose. The cooks had worked for 2 days preparing a feast for the staff. There had been roasted potatoes, braised cabbage, bread that Greta herself had baked, using the last of the white flour allocation before they switched entirely to the grey mixture that was 70% wheat and 30% sawdust. There had been no dessert, no sugar had been available since September. But someone had found honey, and they had drizzled it over slices of bread and pretended it was cake. That had been 3 months ago. Since then, meals had become increasingly sparse, increasingly desperate. By February, they were eating boiled turnips and black bread that crumbled in their hands. By March, even that had become scarce. And then the Americans had come. The capture had been almost anticlimactic. Their unit had been retreating through Belgium when they encountered an American patrol. There had been no dramatic standoff, no heroic resistance. The commanding officer had simply raised his hands and ordered everyone to do the same. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, out of options. The American soldiers had been young, younger than Greta expected. They had seemed almost embarrassed by their role as captors. They had not struck anyone, they had not shouted. They had simply processed the Germans with mechanical efficiency, collecting weapons and documents and personal items before loading everyone onto trucks. Greta had expected cruelty. She had been told her entire life what Americans were like: brutal, uncivilized, barely human. Goebbels had made sure every German understood that surrender meant torture, humiliation, death. But the American soldiers had given them water. They had allowed bathroom breaks during the long drive to the processing center. They had provided blankets when the nights grew cold. It was confusing. Everything she had been taught said this behavior was impossible. The ship rolled again. Somewhere in the hold, a woman moaned in her sleep. The sound of diesel engines vibrated through the metal walls. Greta opened her eyes and stared at the dim light bulb swinging overhead. Gitta stirred beside her. "Do you think they'll kill us?" Her voice was barely audible above the engine noise. German words whispered between two women who had become friends through proximity and shared misery. Greta considered the question carefully. "No," she finally answered. "Americans follow rules. We've seen that. They'll imprison us, Eve. Probably put us to work, but not kill us." "How do you know?" "Because killing us would be inefficient, and Americans are very concerned with efficiency." It was a weak joke. Neither of them laughed, but Gitta nodded slightly, accepting the logic. They sat in silence for a long moment. "I think about my grandmother," Greta said quietly. "When I close my eyes, I see her kitchen, I smell her baking, Zimtschnecken every Sunday. Do you know the last time I smelled cinnamon?" "No." 1942. March. There was a small bakery in Hamburg that still had some. My mother bought a tiny packet, paid 10 times what it was worth. She made Zimtschnecken for my birthday. They were not as good as grandmother's. She used too little cinnamon because the packet was so small, but I can still taste them. Greta's voice cracked slightly. Grandmother died in October 1941, before the sugar disappeared, before the cinnamon disappeared, before everything disappeared. Sometimes I think she was lucky. She never saw what Germany became. Gitta did not respond. She did not need to. Both women understood what Germany had become: a nation eating itself alive, a nation sending its children to die in frozen fields while its cities burned. A nation that had promised glory and delivered only ash. Across the hold, Gerda Kettner watched them with cold eyes. She could hear their whispered conversation, their doubt, their weakness. It disgusted her. These women had sworn oaths to serve the Reich. They had worn the uniform, and now they whispered like frightened children, questioning everything they had believed. Werner had believed. Werner had died believing. If Greta and the others could not maintain faith, then Werner's death meant nothing. Gerda could not allow that. She would not allow that. She clutched the letter in her pocket and turned her face toward the wall. On the 10th day of the voyage, something happened that would change everything. It was late afternoon. The sea had calmed somewhat, and the women had gathered in small groups to eat their daily ration. Hard biscuits, a thin soup made from vegetables that had long since lost any nutritional value, a small portion of canned meat that tasted of salt and preservatives. Liesel Falkenberg had not been eating well. Her young body, still developing at 19, required more calories than she was receiving. She had been giving portions of her rations to Hilda's fever patient, believing she could survive on less. She could not. Without warning, Liesel's body seized. Her eyes rolled back. She collapsed sideways off the bench and began convulsing on the metal floor. Hilda moved immediately. 20 years of nursing experience kicked in before conscious thought. She knelt beside Liesel, turning the girl onto her side to prevent choking, checking her airway, timing the convulsion with a silent count. "Hypoglycemia," she announced to no one in particular. "Her blood sugar has crashed. She needs glucose. She needs sugar, now." The women looked at each other in helpless silence. Sugar. Where would they find sugar? They had not seen sugar in months, years, some of them. The rations provided nothing sweet. The kitchens had nothing sweet. Sugar had become a memory, a myth, something that existed only in stories told by older women who remembered life before the war. "Does anyone have anything?" Hilda's voice carried an edge of desperation she rarely showed. "Candy? Fruit? Anything with sugar?" Silence. Liesel's convulsion continued. Her body jerked and twisted. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. She was 19 years old, and she was dying on the floor of an enemy ship because no one had sugar. A voice cut through the silence. American English. "Here." The women turned. An American soldier stood at the entrance to the hold, young, perhaps 23. He had been assigned to guard duty to ensure the prisoners caused no trouble during the crossing. He had spent 10 days watching these women slowly deteriorate. He had said nothing, done nothing, just watched. Now he stepped forward and held out something in his hand. A Hershey's chocolate bar, standard military issue, part of every American soldier's personal ration. "Give it to her," he said. "Quick!" Hilda did not hesitate. She snatched the chocolate from his hand, broke off a piece, and pressed it against Liesel's lips. As the convulsion subsided, she gently worked the chocolate into the girl's mouth, letting it melt on her tongue, allowing the sugar to absorb directly into her bloodstream. Minutes passed, the longest minutes any of them could remember. And then Liesel's eyes fluttered open. She was disoriented, confused, but alive. The chocolate had pulled her back from the edge. Hilda looked up at the American soldier. He had already turned away, already walking back toward his post. He did not wait for thanks, did not acknowledge what he had done, simply returned to his duty as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Greta sat frozen on her bench, staring at the American soldiers retreating back. He had given his chocolate to a German prisoner, his personal ration, the one sweet thing soldiers carried with them through the misery of war. He had given it without hesitation, without expectation of reward, without anything except the simple human impulse to prevent another human from dying. Everything Greta had been taught said this was impossible. Americans were supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to be cruel. They were supposed to view Germans as subhuman, the same way Germans had been taught to view Americans. That was how war worked. You dehumanized your enemy so you could kill them without guilt. But this soldier had not seen Liesel as an enemy. He had seen her as a girl having a seizure, and he had acted accordingly. Greta felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall she had built around her understanding of the world, a tiny fissure that would eventually grow into something much larger. She did not know it yet, but that chocolate bar would change everything, not by itself, not directly, but it would be the first domino, the first small act of unexpected kindness that would eventually lead to a kitchen in Alabama, a cinnamon roll, and tears that she did not know she still had the capacity to cry. The ship arrived at Norfolk, Virginia on March 21, 1945. The women were processed through a receiving facility with the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized every interaction with their American captors, names recorded, possessions inventoried though they had almost nothing left. Medical examinations conducted by tired doctors who spoke no German and relied on hand gestures and simple English words. Weight, 98 pounds, blood pressure, low, nutritional status, deficient, recommended action, increased caloric intake, vitamin supplementation, monitoring for refeeding syndrome. Greta understood none of these medical terms. She understood only that the American doctor who examined her had gentle hands and tired eyes, and that he had paused when he saw her cracked baker's hands, turning them over with something that looked almost like recognition. "Baker?" he asked through the interpreter. "Yes," Greta answered. 3 years, military bakeries." The doctor nodded and made a note on his chart. Greta did not know what he had written. She did not know that this simple notation would eventually reach Camp Aliceville and influence decisions that would shape the rest of her life. From Norfolk, the women were loaded onto transport trucks. Canvas covered, no windows, they could not see the America they were traveling through. They could only sense it through sound and motion, the rumble of engines, the honking of horns, the voices of Americans going about their daily lives, unaware that a truck full of German prisoners was passing through their towns. The journey took 2 days. They stopped twice at military installations for food and bathroom breaks. The food was substantial, more substantial than anything Greta had eaten in months. Sandwiches with actual meat, apples that were fresh, not wrinkled from months of storage, milk that was cold and white and tasted nothing like the watered-down greyish liquid they had received in Germany. She ate slowly. She remembered Hilda's warning about overwhelming stomachs that had become accustomed to deprivation. She forced herself to chew each bite 20 times, forced herself to stop when her stomach began to protest, even though her mind screamed for more. Gitta did not have the same discipline. She ate too fast on the first stop and spent the night vomiting in the corner of the truck. Hilda tended to her with the patience of someone who had seen much worse. On March 23, 1945, the transport trucks rumbled through the gates of Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Greta glimpsed pine trees through a gap in the canvas covering, green branches heavy with morning dew. After weeks at sea and days traveling across unfamiliar landscape, the sight of trees felt almost dreamlike, something normal in a world that had become unrecognizable. The camp sat in rural Alabama, far from any major city. When the guards ordered the women out of the trucks in heavily accented German, Greta's first impression was of space, so much space. The camp stretched across cleared land with neat rows of wooden barracks, administrative buildings, guard towers, tall wire fences that somehow seemed less oppressive than the cramped ship's hold they had left behind. The sky was enormous, blue and cloudless. Birds sang in the pine trees that surrounded the facility. It looked nothing like what she had imagined a prison camp would look like. She had expected grey concrete, barbed wire, guard dogs, the kind of brutal efficiency she had seen in German military installations. Instead, she saw wooden buildings with painted trim, grass growing between the barracks. American soldiers walking without urgency, some of them carrying coffee cups, one of them reading a newspaper as he strolled toward an administrative building. There were other prisoners already in the camp. Men, thousands of them, from what Greta could see. German soldiers in faded uniforms working in organized groups, moving between buildings with the resigned efficiency of people who had accepted their circumstances. None of them looked starving, none of them looked beaten. They looked tired, yes, defeated, but not destroyed. Captain Virginia Ashworth stood waiting as the German women assembled in uneven lines. She was perhaps 40 years old, Steel-grey hair pinned severely beneath her officer's cap, eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform was crisp, her bearing military, but something in her expression suggested more complexity than simple authority. There was weariness there, and something that might have been grief, carefully controlled, but not entirely hidden. "Welcome to Camp Aliceville," she said in clear English, waiting as a male interpreter translated each sentence into German. "You will be housed in barracks C and D. You will follow all regulations. You will maintain discipline. You will conduct yourselves appropriately." She paused, letting the words sink in. "In return, you will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will have opportunities to work, to correspond with family through the Red Cross, and to maintain your dignity as prisoners of war." Adequate food. The words hung in the air. Greta felt them land in her empty stomach like stones dropping into still water. She could not remember the last time she had eaten anything that could be described as adequate. The ship rations had been minimal. Before that, the final months in Germany had been a slow descent into starvation. Supply lines had collapsed, infrastructure had crumbled, the Reich's promises of victory had dissolved into the reality of defeat. The Geneva Convention of 1929, Article 11, required that prisoner rations be equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the detaining army's own troops. American soldiers received 3,200 to 3,500 calories daily. Prisoners at Camp Aliceville would receive 2,800 to 3,000. Not charity. Procedure. Law. The women were processed through intake procedures with bureaucratic efficiency that Greta was beginning to recognize as characteristically American. Names recorded in triplicate. Possessions inventoried, though they had almost nothing left. Photographs taken. Fingerprints pressed into ink and then onto cards. Medical examinations were conducted by a tired-looking doctor named Edward Calloway. He was perhaps 45, with greying hair and the methodical movements of someone who had performed these examinations hundreds of times. His nurse translated his questions into German. His hands were gentle when he examined each woman, checking lymph nodes, listening to heartbeats, making notes about conditions that months of deprivation had created. He examined Greta last. "Height?" he asked through the interpreter. 5 feet 6 inches. "Weight?" He gestured toward a scale. Greta stepped on. The needle settled. 98 pounds, the nurse recorded. Dr. Calloway frowned. He made a notation. BMI 15.8. Moderate malnutrition. Vitamin deficiencies probable. B12. D. Recommended treatment. Graduated caloric increase. Week 1 through 2, 1,500 calories. Week 3 through 4, 1,800 calories. Week 5 onward, 2,200 calories. Weight gain target 2 pounds per week maximum. Faster risked refeeding syndrome, which could be fatal. He examined her hands carefully, turning them over, studying the cracks and calluses that marked her as a manual worker. "Baker," he said, not a question. "Yes," Greta answered through the interpreter. 3 years, military bakeries. The doctor nodded, making another note on his chart. He looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing something beyond her physical condition. Then he moved on to complete the examination. He handed her a card with instructions that the interpreter translated. She would receive vitamin tablets daily. She would report to the infirmary weekly for weight checks. She would eat everything provided at meals, even if she did not feel hungry. "Your stomach has shrunk," the interpreter explained. "You must eat small amounts frequently. Too much too fast can cause refeeding syndrome. It can be fatal. You must eat slowly. You must eat everything." Greta nodded. She did not fully understand the medical danger, but she understood the instruction. Eat slowly. Eat everything. The barracks were simple but clean. Wooden bunks with thin mattresses, grey blankets that smelled of soap. A wood stove for heat, though the Alabama spring required little warming. Windows that let in actual sunlight. After the darkness of the ship's hold, the brightness felt almost painful. Gitta claimed the bunk above Greta's. Her face had gained the slightest bit of colour since the truck stops, though she still moved with the careful slowness of someone recovering from illness. "It's better than I expected," she whispered in German, as the guards left them to settle in. Hilda was already organising the limited space, her nurse's instincts transforming chaos into order. "Don't get comfortable," she said. We don't know what work they'll assign us. We don't know how long we'll be here. We don't know anything." Liesel sat on her bunk, still looking lost. The chocolate had saved her life, but it had not restored her spirit. She stared at the wooden floor with eyes that seemed to see something far away. And Gerda Kettner chose the bunk furthest from the others. She sat with her back straight, her face expressionless, her hand resting on the pocket where Werner's letter waited. She had spoken almost nothing since the ship. She had watched the Americans with cold assessment. She had accepted no help and offered none. She was watching Greta now. Watching how Greta looked around the barracks with something that might have been relief. Watching how Greta touched the clean blanket with something that might have been gratitude. Watching how Greta seemed to be accepting this captivity with something that might have been surrender. Gerda did not speak, but her eyes promised future confrontation. That first evening in Camp Aliceville, the 34 German women gathered in the barracks' common area as Captain Ashworth addressed them again. She spoke more slowly this time, allowing the interpreter to convey not just words, but meaning. Her voice carried the authority of command, but also something else. Something that might have been respect for the women she was addressing, even though they were enemies. "You are here because you served military functions for an enemy nation," she began. "You are nurses, radio operators, clerks, supply officers. You supported the German war effort. That is why you were captured. That is why you are prisoners." She paused, letting the words settle. "But you are also here because the United States believes in the lawful treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Convention is not optional, it is not negotiable. It is the law that governs how we treat those we have defeated in war." Her voice hardened slightly. "You will work. You will contribute to this camp's operation. Some of you have skills that are needed here. Others will perform basic labor. All of you will follow orders and maintain discipline." She paused again. "In exchange, you will be fed according to military standards. You will receive medical care when needed. You will be housed in appropriate conditions. You will be allowed to write and receive letters through the Red Cross. You will be treated as prisoners of war, not as criminals." Greta listened carefully, watching the captain's face as much as hearing her words. There was grief there, hidden but present. The way her eyes flickered when she mentioned the law. The way her jaw tightened when she spoke of defeat. Later, Greta would learn that Captain Ashworth's husband had died at Normandy, June 1944. He had been among the first wave on Omaha Beach. He had not made it past the waterline. Virginia Ashworth had received the telegram on their 10th wedding anniversary. She could have hated Germans. She had every reason to hate Germans, but she had chosen instead to uphold the standards her husband had died defending. The rules of war, the Geneva Convention, the belief that civilization meant treating enemies with humanity even when they did not deserve it. She did not know if the German women deserved humanity, but she would provide it anyway, because that was what America was supposed to stand for, because that was what her husband had believed. After the speech, the women were led to the mess hall for their first American meal. The building was large, functional. Rows of long tables with benches. American kitchen workers moved behind serving counters, dispensing food with mechanical efficiency. The smell hit Greta before she reached the counter. Meat, actual meat, not the horseflesh or mystery proteins that had become standard in Germany. Potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread. Her stomach cramped with anticipation. Metal trays were distributed. The women moved through the serving line. American workers filled their trays without comment, their faces neutral but not hostile. Greta stared at her tray in disbelief. Beef stew, real beef, identifiable chunks of meat in rich gravy, mashed potatoes with visible butter melting on top, green beans from a can, but abundant. White bread, soft and light, nothing like the dense dark loaves she had baked for years. A glass of milk, white and cold. She estimated the calories, 1,800, on a single tray, more than she had eaten in 3 days during the final weeks in Germany. Around her, other women stared at their trays with similar disbelief. Liesel began to cry quietly. Even Hilda seemed momentarily overwhelmed, her professional composure cracking at the sight of actual food in actual abundance. "Eat," Hilda commanded softly, recovering herself. "Slowly. Your stomachs aren't used to this. Small bites. Chew thoroughly. Stop if you feel full, even if the tray isn't empty. You can eat more later. But slowly now. Slowly." Greta took a small bite of the mashed potatoes. The butter, the salt, the creamy texture. It hit her tongue like a memory from another lifetime. She had to close her eyes against the sudden emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. This was enemy food, served by enemy hands in an enemy country, but it was given freely, without cruelty, without the starvation rations that had made every meal a reminder of defeat. Gerda Kettner sat at the far end of the table, eating methodically. Her face betrayed nothing. She did not cry. She did not express relief. She simply consumed the food with the same cold efficiency she brought to everything. But Greta noticed that Gerda cleaned her tray completely. Every last bite, every last drop of gravy. Even Gerda Kettner, who believed the Americans were monsters, could not resist the pull of adequate food. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta stared at the wooden ceiling and felt something she had not felt in years. Full. Her stomach felt strange, not uncomfortable but unfamiliar. When had she last felt full? She could not remember. The sensation was so foreign that it almost frightened her. Gitta whispered from above, "Greta, are you awake?" "Yes." "What do you think America will be like beyond this camp?" Greta considered the question. She thought about the trees she had glimpsed from the truck, the enormous sky, the casual abundance she had witnessed in the mess hall. "I don't know," she finally answered, "but I think it's different from what we were told." "The soldier on the ship, the one who gave Liesel the chocolate, do you think about him?" "Yes." "Why do you think he did it?" Greta had been asking herself the same question for days. "I don't know, maybe he simply didn't want to watch someone die. Maybe that's all it was. A human impulse, not an American impulse or a German impulse. Just human." "Is that possible, after everything?" "I don't know, Gitta. I don't know anything anymore." They fell silent. Eventually, Gitta's breathing deepened into sleep. But Greta remained awake, thinking about chocolate bars and cinnamon rolls, and the way the world could surprise you. Somewhere across the camp, in a kitchen she had not yet seen, an American sergeant named Walter Brennan was cleaning his ovens after the evening meal. He had been baking for 30 years. He had lost his wife to cancer in 1942. He had stopped making cinnamon rolls after she died because she had loved them too much. He did not know that in 3 weeks he would make cinnamon rolls again. He did not know that a German prisoner would taste them and weep. He did not know that a simple act of sharing would bridge something that propaganda had tried to make unbridgeable. But that moment was coming, and everything was about to change. The next morning began at 6 with the sound of a bell echoing across Camp Aliceville. Breakfast was served at 6:30, oatmeal with milk, toast with butter, scrambled eggs, orange juice, and on each table a small bowl of white crystals, sugar. Greta stared at it, available, unlimited. She could take as much as she wanted. She had not seen unlimited sugar since 1941. Her hand trembled as she spooned a small amount into her oatmeal. She had to remind herself to eat slowly, to chew, to not let the abundance overwhelm the discipline required to safely restore her depleted body. After breakfast, work assignments were distributed. Hilda and 2 other nurses went to the infirmary. Liesel and the clerks went to the records office. Gitta and the radio operators were assigned to maintenance and cleaning. When Greta identified herself as a baker, Captain Ashworth's expression shifted. "We have a kitchen staff shortage, but placing you there requires approval. For now, you'll work in the laundry." Greta understood the unspoken concern. A baker had access to food, to supplies, to potential tools that could become weapons. Trust had to be earned. The laundry building sat at the eastern edge of the camp. Private Thomas Aldridge was assigned to guard it. He was 24 years old, from Dayton, Ohio, tall and lean with close-cropped brown hair and eyes that held a hardness unusual in someone so young. He carried his rifle with casual familiarity. He watched the German women with an expression that was not quite hostility, but was certainly not warmth. His grandfather Heinrich had been a prisoner of war in a German camp during World War I, 18 months of captivity that had nearly killed him. Heinrich had filled young Thomas with stories of cruelty, of deprivation, of the casual inhumanity of captors who viewed their prisoners as subhuman. "Never trust a prisoner," Heinrich had told him. "They will smile at you and stab you when you turn your back." Thomas had carried those warnings into this war. He had fought in the Philippines. He had watched friends die. He had learned to view the other side as less than human. Now he guarded German women who folded laundry and said, "Thank you," in careful English. It was confusing. During lunch break one day, Greta said those 2 words to Corporal Daniel Whitmore, the 26-year-old translator who had studied German at Princeton before the war. "You're welcome," he replied. Aldridge watched the exchange from his post. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. But the woman who had said thank you did not look like a threat. She looked tired, hungry, lost. That afternoon, a scent drifted through the laundry windows. Cinnamon, butter, vanilla. Something baking, something indulgent. Greta stopped mid-motion, a wet sheet forgotten in her hands. Her eyes closed involuntarily. The scent transported her across years and oceans. Her grandmother's kitchen. Sunday morning's warmth and safety before the world fell apart. Gitta appeared beside her. "What is that?" "Cinnamon rolls. Americans call them cinnamon rolls." "It smells like before." "I know." They stood at the windows, breathing deeply, trying to capture and hold the sweetness that reminded them of everything they had lost. Aldridge watched them from his post. He did not understand why the German women seemed so affected by the smell. It was just cinnamon rolls. He did not know that they had not smelled cinnamon in years. Did not know that sugar had become a myth in their homeland. But he noticed. He filed it away. And 3 weeks later, when he watched the baker cry over a cinnamon roll, he would remember this moment. He would remember the longing on their faces. And he would begin to understand something his grandfather had never taught him. That enemies were also human. The kitchen door opened for her on April 3rd, 1945, 11 days after arriving at Camp Aliceville. 11 days of washing sheets and folding uniforms and breathing in the distant scent of cinnamon that drifted across the compound like a ghost from another life. Sergeant Walter Brennan had been watching her. He had noticed her hands first. The way she folded kitchen linens when they came through the laundry. The precision. The economy of motion. Each fold exact, creating perfect rectangles that stacked uniformly. These were not the movements of someone who had learned to fold in captivity. These were ingrained habits, professional habits, the muscle memory of someone who had spent years working in kitchens. Walter Brennan was 52 years old. He had been baking since he was 14, learning the trade from his Polish immigrant father in a Pittsburgh bakery. He knew bakers' hands when he saw them. He had mentioned this to Captain Ashworth on April 2nd. The German woman in the laundry, the one with the cracked hands, she was a baker. Ashworth had looked up from her paperwork. How do you know? I've been doing this for 30 years, Captain. I know my own kind. The captain considered. We're short-staffed in the kitchen. Peterson shipped out last week. Rodriguez has been reassigned to the Pacific. I'm running a facility that feeds 6,000 people with half the personnel I need. I understand the security concerns, Sergeant. She's a baker, and we need bakers. A pause, then. Start her on basic duties. Supervised, restricted access. Private Aldridge maintains watch at all times. Any indication of trouble, any at all, and she goes back to laundry permanently. Understood, Captain. And so on the morning of April 3rd, Corporal Whitmore appeared at the laundry with new orders. Kitchen duty, starting today. Sergeant Brennan requested you. Greta's hands stilled in the soapy water. Kitchen duty. Someone had noticed. The walk across the compound felt longer than it should have. Past the administrative building, past the barracks where male prisoners worked, past the guard towers where American soldiers watched everything. The kitchen building was larger than she had expected. Through the windows, she could see massive ovens, industrial mixers, stainless steel preparation tables gleaming under fluorescent lights. Private Aldridge was waiting at the door. Kitchen assignment, he said. Yes. He nodded once and opened the door. And the smell hit her like a physical force. Bread baking, onions sautéing, coffee brewing. Her stomach cramped with a hunger that transcended mere emptiness. This was the hunger of a professional denied her craft. Sergeant Brennan stood near the industrial ovens, reviewing preparation lists. He was a large man with greying hair and weathered hands scarred from years of contact with hot surfaces. Baker's hands, like hers, different in size but shaped by the same work. He handed her a white apron and a cap without speaking. The fabric was clean, starched, professional. Greta put it on with trembling hands. For the first time in 6 months, she was dressing for kitchen work. For the first time in 6 months, she was being recognized as what she was. Through Whitmore, Brennan explained the rules. You work only at stations I assign. You touch nothing without permission. You ask questions before acting. Private Aldridge will be nearby at all times. Any problems, and you return to laundry. Understood? Understood, Sergeant. He pointed to the far corner of the kitchen, where a mountain of potatoes waited. Start there. Potatoes, mountains of them. Greta's hands moved automatically. Peel, turn, peel, turn. The brown skin falling away to reveal pale flesh beneath. It was mindless work, but being in a kitchen again felt like returning to herself. She observed everything while she worked. The Americans used ingredients with casual abundance that made her chest ache. Butter measured in pounds, eggs by the dozen, milk in large metal containers, and sugar, 50-pound bags of it stacked on storage shelves like they were nothing special. Camp Aliceville's kitchen served 6,000 people daily. It required 4,500 pounds of meat per week, 2,000 loaves of bread per day, 800 gallons of milk per week. The logistics were staggering, and here was sugar, piled high when Germany had none. Brennan worked with practiced efficiency. He moved between stations, adjusting seasonings, checking temperatures, correcting techniques with brief words. His movements were economical, precise, confident. She watched him knead bread dough during a quiet moment. His technique was different from German methods, more aggressive. He used the heel of his palm to push the dough away, then folded it back, rotated it, repeated. He caught her watching. Their eyes met across the kitchen. Two bakers recognizing each other across the divide of war. Then Brennan nodded slightly and returned to his work. The days developed a rhythm. Greta arrived at 5:30 each morning. She peeled potatoes, washed dishes, scrubbed preparation surfaces. She did whatever Brennan assigned, never reaching beyond her designated tasks. Slowly, the restrictions eased. Day 3, chopping vegetables. Day 5, assisting with bread shaping. Day 7, mixing biscuit dough alone. Whitmore had become more than a translator. He talked with her during breaks, sharing stories about his life before the war. He had studied German literature at Princeton, Goethe, Schiller. "I still love the language," he told her one afternoon. "The precision of it. I studied it because I thought it was beautiful. I still think it's beautiful, even now." "Language is not responsible for what people do with it," Greta said. "German did not cause the war. Germans caused the war. The language just carried the orders." Whitmore nodded slowly. "That's a distinction most people don't make." Aldridge watched these exchanges with growing discomfort. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his memory. Never trust a prisoner. But Hoffman did not scheme or plot. She simply worked. And she said thank you every time, for the translation, for the instruction, for the opportunity. His grandfather had never mentioned enemies who said thank you. One afternoon, Aldridge approached her station during a quiet moment. "Meine Großmutter," he said haltingly. "My grandmother. Sie war Deutsche." Greta looked up, startled to hear German from this stern guard. His pronunciation was terrible, but he was trying. "Your grandmother was German?" He nodded stiffly. "From Bavaria. She taught my mother some words. My mother taught me, before my grandfather forbade it." "Your grandfather forbade German in your home?" "He was a prisoner. In the First War, German camp. He hated everything German after that." Aldridge paused. "But my grandmother's strudel, he never hated that." It was the most he had ever said to her. And it was about food, about a grandmother, about the complicated ways that hatred and love could exist in the same family. Greta did not know what to say, so she simply nodded. Aldridge returned to his post without another word. But something had shifted between them. In the barracks, tensions were rising. Gerda Kettner had been watching Greta's kitchen assignment with cold fury. On the 8th night, she struck. The women had gathered in the common area. Some were writing letters, others simply sat, exhausted. Gerda stood abruptly. "Look at her," she said, pointing at Greta. "Look at our baker, our collaborator." The word hung in the air like smoke. "I am not a collaborator," Greta said quietly. "I am a prisoner who has been assigned work. Work in their kitchen, baking their bread, feeding their soldiers while Germany starves. Germany was starving before I was captured. My work changes nothing." Gerda's eyes narrowed. "Your work changes you. I see how you look at them, how you smile at that corporal, how you study their sergeant like a disciple studying a master. He is a master. I can recognize skill regardless of nationality. You can recognize an opportunity to betray everything you swore to uphold." Gitta stepped forward, positioning herself between them. "She's surviving. We're all surviving. That's not betrayal. Some prisoners maintain their dignity, their loyalty." Gerda's voice dropped to a whisper. My Werner died believing in Germany. If Werner could see you now, Hoffmann, baking bread for the enemy, smiling at them, he would be disgusted. The mention of Werner was calculated, cruel, but Greta did not flinch. Your Werner died in a frozen field for a regime that lied to him, that lied to all of us. I am sorry for your loss. Truly, but his death does not obligate me to pretend those lies were truth. For a moment, Gerda seemed about to strike her. Then Hilda stepped between them. Enough. We are all prisoners here. We have all lost things. Fighting among ourselves serves no one. Gerda held her position for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to her bunk without another word. Lines had been drawn. Sides had been chosen. April 12, 1945. President Roosevelt was dead. The announcement spread through Camp Aliceville like wildfire. Brennan stopped mid-task. The kitchen workers looked at each other with shock and grief. Roosevelt had been president for 12 years, a constant in American life. And now he was gone. Greta watched the Americans process their grief. Brennan stepped away from his station and stood at the window, looking at nothing. His massive shoulders sagged. My wife voted for him 4 times, he said to no one. Whitmore translated quietly. She believed in him, said he was going to fix everything. She died before she could see if she was right. His wife, the one who had died of cancer in 1942. Aldridge stood at his post, his expression carefully neutral. But his grip on his rifle had tightened. His eyes were bright with something quickly suppressed. That evening, the camp held an impromptu memorial. The flag was lowered to half-staff. Someone played taps on a bugle. The German prisoners watched from their barracks windows. Gerda watched with cold satisfaction. The enemy's leader was dead. But Greta watched with recognition. She saw Brennan standing at attention, his face carved from stone. She saw Aldridge with his hand over his heart. She saw Whitmore wiping his eyes. These were not monsters. These were men mourning the leader they had loved. The cracks in her worldview widened further. April 15th, 1945. 3 weeks since arrival, 12 days in the kitchen. And the day everything changed. Brennan had been preparing for the officers' weekly breakfast. Fresh eggs, bacon, and cinnamon rolls. He had not made cinnamon rolls since his wife died. Margaret had loved them. Every Sunday morning for 23 years of marriage, he had made cinnamon rolls while she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, watching him work. She said it was her favorite thing, not the rolls themselves, but watching him make them. After she died, he could not bring himself to make them. The smell would be too much, so he had taught other cooks to prepare them and stayed away entirely. But now there was a shortage of skilled bakers, and he decided to make them himself. For the first time in 3 years. Greta had been assigned to bread duty that morning. She was shaping loaves when the smell began to fill the kitchen. Cinnamon, butter, sugar, vanilla. She stopped working. Her hands stilled on the dough. Brennan was measuring flour into a massive mixing bowl, 6 cups. His movements were deliberate, as if each gesture cost him something. He added sugar, 1/2 cup, salt, 1 teaspoon, yeast, 2 packets, warm milk, 1½ cups. Greta watched, transfixed. He cracked 2 eggs into the mixture, added softened butter, 1/2 pound. He began to mix, first with a wooden spoon, then by hand. He turned it out onto the floured surface and began to knead. 10 minutes, his technique was aggressive. He used the heel of his palm to push, then folded, then rotated. The dough transformed, becoming smooth and elastic. He shaped it into a ball, placed it in a greased bowl, covered it with a clean cloth. 1 hour, he said. Then we roll. The hour passed. Brennan returned to the dough. He punched it down, turned it out, reached for a rolling pin. The rectangle emerged slowly. 18 inches by 12. Even thickness throughout. Then came the filling. Softened butter, spread edge to edge. The motion was gentle, almost tender. He was not just preparing food, he was performing a ritual, a remembrance. The cinnamon-sugar mixture came next. 2 tablespoons of cinnamon, 1 cup of sugar, mixed together and distributed evenly. The smell intensified. Greta's grandmother's kitchen. Zimtschnecken rising in the morning light. Brennan rolled the dough into a tight spiral, cut it into 12 pieces, arranged them in a greased pan, covered them for a second rise. 30 more minutes. When he slid the pan into the oven, Greta realized she had stopped breathing. 22 minutes. The timer rang. Brennan removed the pan. The rolls were golden brown, perfectly risen. He prepared the glaze. Powdered sugar, milk, vanilla extract whisked together. He poured it over the warm rolls. It ran into the spirals, pooled in the crevices, and then he did something unexpected. He cut a single roll from the corner. The corner roll, the one bakers traditionally kept for themselves. He placed it on a small plate, added a fork, and walked across the kitchen to where Greta stood. Whitmore translated, "You taste. You cannot make what you don't understand." Greta stared at the plate. This was the officer's special order, not for prisoners. Her hands trembled as she accepted it. "Sergeant Brennan, I cannot. This is not for prisoners." He looked at her with weathered eyes that had seen so much. "You are kitchen worker now. Kitchen workers must know the food they make. This is not gift. This is training. Eat." She sat on a nearby stool, the fork gripped in her unsteady hand. The other kitchen workers had paused, watching. Aldridge had shifted his position, his attention focused on this scene. The entire kitchen held its breath. Greta cut a small piece. The roll separated easily, revealing layers of dough and cinnamon and sugar. She raised it to her mouth, and the moment it touched her tongue, something inside her shattered. The sweetness overwhelmed her. Not just sugar, layers of flavor, butter and cinnamon and vanilla, and the complex notes of properly developed dough, warm and soft and rich beyond anything she had tasted in 4 years. Her eyes closed. And she was not in Alabama anymore. She was in Bavaria, 8 years old, her grandmother's kitchen, the old woman's hands moving through dough, the smell of Zimtschnecken. Sunday morning, church bells in the distance. "Flour needs love, Greta," her grandmother said. "Knead by hand, not by machine. The dough knows the difference." Her grandmother had died in October 1941. Before the sugar disappeared, before everything disappeared. Greta had not cried at the funeral, had not cried when they lowered the coffin into the earth, had been too numb. She had not cried since. But now, in an American kitchen, with enemy eyes watching, she could not stop the tears. They came without warning, rolling down her cheeks. Her shoulders began to shake. She took another bite anyway, forced herself to continue, to taste fully what she had been denied. "I'm sorry," she whispered in German, then English. "I'm sorry, I have not tasted sugar in years. Real sugar, like this." Whitmore translated, though her tears needed no interpretation. Around the kitchen, the Americans exchanged glances. Aldridge looked away, his expression uncomfortable, his grip on his rifle loosening for the first time. Even Brennan's face showed cracks. Recognition. Understanding. Memory of his own losses. "Your mother," he asked through Whitmore, "did she teach you to bake?" "My grandmother, she died in 1941. Before everything," Brennan nodded slowly. "My wife died in 1942. cancer. She loved cinnamon rolls. I haven't made them since she passed. Until today. The words hung in the air. Two people who had lost. Two people who had stopped. Two people connected by flour and sugar and the memories that simple food could contain. Greta forced herself to eat slowly, to savor. Each bite was a revelation. She had forgotten food could be joyful. When she finished, she set down the fork and wiped her eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant Brennan. I understand now what you want me to create. I will learn your methods. I will honor your teaching." He nodded once. Something had passed between them, something that transcended enemy and captor. He returned to his work. The kitchen resumed its rhythm, but Aldridge remained at his post, watching the woman who had wept over a cinnamon roll. His grandfather had said, prisoners were not like us. But she had cried the way his mother cried when she talked about her own grandmother. His grandfather had been wrong. 3 days later, the news arrived from Germany. Mrs. Eleanor Sinclair, the Red Cross volunteer, appeared at the barracks with a bundle of letters. She was 62 years old, with white hair and gentle eyes. She had been doing this work for 8 months. She knew which letters carried good news and which carried bad. Greta's letter was thin, worn, the handwriting careful. She waited until evening to open it. The letter was from her sister, Emma, dated February the 15th, 1945. "Dear Greta, I don't know how to begin."
I don't know if you're alive to receive this.
Her hands began to tremble. "Mother is gone. The bombing raid on January 17th. Hamburg is destroyed. Our street is a crater. I found her 3 days later, under the rubble of our kitchen. She was holding the family photograph, the one from before the war. She held it until the end." The words blurred. "Sophie and I survived because we were in the countryside looking for potatoes. We came back to nothing, just smoke and ruins." Her mother, the woman who had supported her decision to join the auxiliary corps, who had written letters every week until the postal system collapsed, dead, buried under rubble, holding a photograph. "Don't come home, sister. There is no home left. Stay wherever you are. Live. That's all any of us can do now." She folded the letter, placed it in her pocket, did not speak. Gitta found her an hour later, sitting outside the barracks, staring at the Alabama stars. "Your mother?" "Yes. I'm sorry, Greta." "She was holding our photograph. Emma said she was holding it when they found her." Gitta sat beside her. They did not speak. "The stars here are so bright," Greta finally said. "In Hamburg the sky was always red. From the fires, I had forgotten what stars looked like." They sat until the guards sent them back inside. The next morning, Greta reported to the kitchen as usual. Her face was pale, her eyes red, but her hands were steady as she tied her apron. Brennan noticed immediately. He said nothing at first. Let her work. Let her hands move through the familiar motions. But during a quiet moment, he approached her station. "Bad news," he said through Whitmore. "My mother, January, Hamburg." Brennan nodded slowly. "War takes everything from everyone. German, American, doesn't matter. We all lose people we love." He paused. "Your mother would want you to keep living, keep working. Honor her by surviving well." The simple words broke something open. She nodded, unable to speak, and returned to her dough with tears streaming down her face, but her hands moved correctly. Working through grief was something she understood. Aldridge watched from his post. He thought about his own grandmother, who had died the year before. He thought about how loss looked the same, regardless of the flag you served under. His grandfather's voice had grown quieter in his memory. May 1st, 1945. The inspection committee was coming. Word had spread through Camp Aliceville 3 days earlier. 3 colonels from regional command, 2 War Department officials. They would evaluate everything. Sergeant Brennan had received specific instructions. The inspection committee would be served a demonstration meal. roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and cinnamon rolls for dessert. 48 cinnamon rolls. Brennan looked at Greta when he received the order. "You make them. 48 rolls. Perfect. I will supervise, but your hands will do the work." Greta understood what this meant. This was performance under scrutiny. Success could mean continued trust. Failure could mean return to laundry. She spent 2 days practicing. Small batches, perfecting technique. Brennan watched critically, adjusting her methods. More butter in the filling, roll tighter, space them closer. On the third practice day, she produced a batch that made him pause. He examined them carefully, tested the texture, checked the browning, tasted a corner piece. Finally, he nodded. "Good, you make them this way for the inspection." The night before, Greta could not sleep. Gitta whispered from above. "Nervous?" "Terrified. Everything I've earned depends on those rolls being perfect." "They will be. You're the best baker I've ever known." "I'm the only baker you've ever known." "That doesn't make it less true." Despite her anxiety, Greta smiled. At 2 o'clock in the morning, someone else was awake. Gerda Kettner moved through darkness with careful precision. She had studied the guard rotation. She knew the gaps. The kitchen was unlocked. Camp security focused on preventing escape, not protecting baking supplies. She stood in the darkness, letting her eyes adjust. Moonlight illuminated stainless steel surfaces. She had not planned this, not consciously. She had simply found herself awake, thinking about Greta and the inspection and everything that woman represented. Collaboration, betrayal, the abandonment of everything they had sworn. Werner had died believing. And now this baker was going to impress American officials with cinnamon rolls. Gerda found the preparation station where Greta had arranged her ingredients. Sugar in a sealed container, pre-portioned. She picked up the container of salt. It was heavy in her hands. She opened the sugar container. The white crystals gleamed. She began to pour. She did not know that Private Aldridge was outside, unable to sleep. Nightmares plagued him since the Philippines. He was smoking a cigarette near the kitchen when he saw movement through the window. A figure. Doing something at the preparation station. His training kicked in. He moved silently, finding a better angle. He watched. He saw the woman pour something from one container into another. Kettner, the cold one, she finished and slipped back into the night. Aldridge let her go. He filed the information away. Greta arrived at 4 a.m. Her hands were steady as she gathered ingredients. She had conquered her anxiety through preparation. Brennan was already there, checking oven temperatures. She reached for the sugar container. "Wait." Aldridge stood in the doorway. His face was drawn. "Don't use that sugar. It's been contaminated." Silence. Brennan crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. "Explain." "I couldn't sleep. Went outside around 0200. Saw someone through the window. A woman putting something into that container." "Which woman?" Aldridge hesitated. His grandfather's voice echoed. But the woman crying over cinnamon rolls had not stabbed anyone. The woman mourning her mother had not plotted. "Kettner," he said, "the supply officer." Brennan opened the container and sniffed. Salt mixed with the sugar.
Would have ruined everything. He looked at Greta. "You knew nothing of this?" "No, Sergeant, I swear it." He studied her. Whatever he saw satisfied him. "We say nothing for now. Hoffman, you have fresh ingredients?" "I would need to measure new sugar." "Then measure it. Start over. You have time if you begin now." Greta looked at Aldridge. "Thank you. You did not have to tell." He shrugged. "I saw what I saw. Lying wouldn't be right." He turned and walked to his post.
Greta gathered fresh sugar and began again. The inspection committee arrived at noon. Captain Ashworth led them through the camp. Barracks, infirmary, work programs. At 12:30 they entered the kitchen. Greta stood at her station, invisible in her white apron. Just another worker, just another prisoner. Brennan presented the demonstration meal, explained procedures, answered questions about supply chains and Geneva Convention compliance. The food was served at 1300. The officials ate, pleased with the chicken, appreciative of the potatoes. Then the cinnamon rolls arrived, 48 of them, golden brown and glistening with glaze. Colonel Harrison, the senior officer, selected one and took a bite. He chewed slowly. His eyebrows rose. "Sergeant Brennan, this is the best cinnamon roll I've eaten in military service, perhaps ever." Brennan allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you, Colonel, but I can't take full credit. These were made by one of our kitchen workers."
One of your staff?" Brennan gestured toward Greta. "Hoffman, a German prisoner, former military baker, 3 years of professional experience." Harrison set down his cinnamon roll and studied Greta. "A German prisoner made these?" "Yes, Colonel, under supervision, but the technique is hers." Harrison was silent. "Interesting approach," one of the colonels said, "using prisoner skills productively." "The Geneva Convention encourages it, sir," Captain Ashworth said.
"Prisoners who work are healthier, more manageable." Harrison nodded. He took another bite. "She's done what Goebbels claimed was impossible, proved that the enemy can also create something beautiful." He addressed Greta directly. "What's your name?" "Margareta Hoffman, sir. I was baker for Wehrmacht 3 years. Now I work here." "Where did you learn to bake like this?" "My grandmother, sir, in Bavaria, and Sergeant Brennan has taught me American methods." "No, your grandmother would be proud." Greta felt tears threatening but forced them back. "Thank you, sir. I hope so." After the committee departed, Brennan found Greta cleaning her station. "You did well. Better than well. You made me look good in front of colonels." "Thank you for the opportunity, Sergeant." "You earned the opportunity. That's different from being given it." He paused. "When this war ends, things will change. I don't know what happens to German prisoners, but whatever happens, remember that you can bake. No one can take that away." 1 week later, the war in Europe ended, May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came at 11 o'clock in the morning. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. On the American side, celebration erupted. Soldiers embraced. Some wept with relief. In the German barracks, there was only silence. Greta stood at the window, watching the Americans celebrate. She thought about Hamburg, about her mother, under rubble, about the country she could no longer recognize. Around her, women processed the news in their own ways. Some wept, some sat in stunned stillness. Gerda Kettner stood apart, her back rigid. The investigation into the sabotage had been handled quietly. Captain Ashworth had confronted Gerda the day after the inspection. Gerda had not denied it, had not apologized. She had been confined to barracks, extra duties assigned, but no formal charges. The war was ending. Now, as surrender was announced, Gerda's rigid posture began to crack. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Werner's letter. "We will win, for Germany." Germany had lost. Werner had died for nothing. Her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall. Everything she had believed, everything that had made Werner's death bearable, gone. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, the letter clutched in her hands, and began to shake. Greta watched from across the room. She could have felt satisfaction. This woman had tried to sabotage her. But looking at Gerda now, broken on the floor, Greta felt only recognition. She crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Werner," Gerda whispered. "My Werner." I know. Greta put her arms around the woman who had tried to destroy her, held her as she shook, let her cry. They stayed that way for a long time. When Gerda finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer. You knew about the sugar. I knew. Why didn't you report me? Because you had already lost enough. Werner, your country, your faith. What would punishment accomplish except add to the suffering? Gerda stared at her. I don't understand you, Hoffman. I tried to ruin you and you repay me with mercy. Not mercy, recognition. We are all broken in different ways. Punishment wouldn't heal you, perhaps compassion might. Gerda did not respond. But the cold hatred that had defined her began to thaw. It was a beginning. June 1945. The war was over. The future remained uncertain. Announcements came about repatriation. German prisoners would be sent home. Greta received the news with mixed emotions. Home. What home? Hamburg was rubble. Her mother was dead. Her sisters were surviving with an aunt she barely remembered. She was not the only one asking these questions. Gitta had learned Dresden remained inaccessible. Her sister Anneliese was still missing. Hilda had received word that her Munich hospital was destroyed. Liesel had no family left at all. One evening, 9 women gathered in the barracks. Greta had called the meeting. We need to talk about what happens next. What's there to talk about? They'll ship us home. But what is home now? Gitta said. Ruins? Starvation? Silence. What if we didn't go back? Liesel said quietly. What if we asked to stay? The idea hung in the air. Stay in America? As what? Refugees. Displaced persons. There are laws. They would never allow it. We're Germans. We were the enemy. The war is over. Greta thought about Brennan, Whitmore, Aldridge. Some of these Americans have shown us that they see us as people. We can ask. The worst they can do is say no. Together they composed a letter to Captain Ashworth. The captain received them the following day. She listened as Greta presented their case. 9 women, no families, skills that could contribute, a desire to build new lives. When Greta finished, Ashworth was silent. This is unprecedented. I'm not certain it's legally possible. We understand, Captain, but we had to ask. Why would you want to stay? This is the country that defeated yours. Greta chose her words carefully. With respect, Captain, Germany defeated itself. We were taught that Americans were monsters. Instead, we found people who fed us, treated our illnesses, taught us skills. She paused. I learned something in your kitchen. Sergeant Brennan lost his wife. He stopped making her favorite food because the memory was too painful. Then he made it anyway, and he shared it with me. An enemy prisoner. He didn't have to do that. He did it because he saw me as a person. Ashworth's expression softened. We discovered that everything we were taught was wrong. We cannot go back to Germany and pretend otherwise. We can only go forward, and forward means staying here. Da, the captain was quiet. I'll forward your request through proper channels. I make no promises. This will require approvals far above my authority. We understand. Thank you for trying. The bureaucratic process moved slowly through summer 1945. Letters were written, forms were filed, officials debated. Meanwhile, Greta kept working in the kitchen. Her skills had become essential. Her English improved steadily. Whitmore gave her books to read. Aldridge had changed too. The rigid tension had softened. One afternoon, he approached her station. I told my mother about you, he said, in my last letter, about the cinnamon rolls, about how you cried. Greta looked up, surprised. She wrote back that I should remember that moment, that when I'm old and wondering what the war meant, I should remember the woman who cried over sugar. Because that's what war really costs. Not just lives, sweetness, the simple things that make life worth living. Your mother sounds wise. She is. She also said that if my grandfather couldn't forgive Germans, I could forgive him for that. But I didn't have to carry his hatred for him. He paused. I'm not carrying it anymore. The day the repatriation trucks came, Gerda Kettner found Greta outside the barracks. She held a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. "This is my mother-in-law's recipe," Gerda said. "Apple pie, Werner's favorite. He used to say no one made it like his mother." Greta took the paper. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you didn't report me, because you held me when I fell, because you showed me there was another way to survive." The truck horn sounded. "I was wrong about you, Hoffman. I was wrong about many things. Perhaps that's what losing teaches us, how much we never really knew." She climbed into the truck without looking back. Greta stood, holding the recipe, watching until the truck disappeared. She never saw Gerda again. But she kept that recipe for 50 years, next to Brennan's cinnamon roll recipe. 2 gifts from 2 different people, both teaching her about forgiveness. September 1945. The letter arrived from Washington. Captain Ashworth called the 9 women to her office. "Your request has been reviewed at multiple levels. It went to the War Department, caused quite a bit of discussion." The women waited. "There's no established framework for what you're asking. The Geneva Convention covers treatment and repatriation, not what happens when prisoners don't want to be repatriated." She paused. "However, a provision has been found. Displaced persons, people who cannot return due to conditions there. Given the destruction in Germany, given that several of you have no surviving family, you have been classified as potential displaced persons." Greta's heart pounded. "You will not be forcibly repatriated. You will remain while your cases are processed. You will need sponsors, American citizens willing to take responsibility. You will need employment. You will need to demonstrate that you can contribute." She set down the paper. "This is not a guarantee. It's an opportunity to prove you deserve it." Gitta gripped Greta's hand. "Thank you, Captain. I supported it because it was right. My husband died at Normandy, believing America stood for something, that people could become more than what their circumstances made them. If I refuse that to others, I betray what he died for." The sponsors came from unexpected places. Sergeant Brennan was first. "She's the best baker I've trained in 30 years. I'm retiring next year, going back to Pennsylvania. There's a bakery that needs help. She can work for me." Private Aldridge came next. His request was for Gitta. "I'm going home to Ohio. My mother runs a boarding house. She needs help. And my grandfather was wrong about prisoners. I want to prove it." Mrs. Sinclair sponsored Liesel. Dr. Calloway sponsored Hilda. One by one, the 9 women found their paths. July 1946. As the final paperwork was processed, a ceremony was held. Nothing official, just a gathering in the mess hall. Captain Ashworth presented each woman with a letter confirming their status as legal residents. Brennan had made cinnamon rolls. Greta stood with one in her hand, looking at the faces around her. Americans who had started as captors and become something closer to family. German women who had started as enemies. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. The Sunday mornings that would never come again. The mother she had lost. The sisters she hoped to someday bring here. She bit into the cinnamon roll. The sweetness flooded her senses. Everything she had lost and everything she had found. But this time she did not cry. This time she smiled. 1970, Philadelphia. The bell above the door chimed as a customer entered Greta's bakery. The shop was small, corner of Chestnut Street, a modest storefront with hand-painted lettering. German rye, American cinnamon rolls, honest bread since 1946. Margaretta Weston, née Hoffman, looked up from the counter. She was 52 now, grey at the temples, hands still bearing the calluses of 40 years of baking. She had married Harold Weston in 1952, an accountant, a quiet man who loved her bread. They had 2 daughters, Emma, named for her sister, Helena, named for Hilda. Sergeant Walter Brennan had died in 1968, 75 years old, peacefully in his sleep. He had left her his entire collection of recipe books, 47 volumes. For the most honest baker I ever knew, his will had said. She had cried when she read those words. Gitta had married Thomas Aldridge in 1949. The man who had once gripped his rifle whenever prisoners passed had become the man who held her hand at their wedding in a small Ohio church. His grandfather, Heinrich, had refused to attend, had died 2 years later, still bitter. But Thomas understood, and Gitta understood, and their 3 children grew up speaking English and German, knowing that enemies could become family when both sides chose love over hatred. They visited Greta twice a year, Memorial Day and Christmas. 2 women who had survived together. They never spoke much about those days. They simply sat, drank coffee, and watched their children play. Hilda had become chief surgical nurse at Johns Hopkins, never married. "I married my work," she said. Liesel had become a librarian in Boston, had eventually found and married a German-American professor who helped her make peace with her past. In 1972, a letter had arrived from Munich. Gerda had written it 2 weeks before she died of a heart attack. "I have thought about you every day since Alabama, not because you forgave me for the salt, but because you held me when I collapsed. No one forced you to do that." The letter continued. "I remarried in 1952, a widower with 2 stepchildren. We opened a small bakery in Munich. I learned to bake again, not as well as you, but well enough. I learned to find joy in flour and sugar again. I want you to know that Werner's mother's apple pie recipe found a home. I made it every year on Werner's birthday, and every year I thought of you, and I was grateful. The lesson I tried to teach my stepchildren was this: sometimes the enemy is just someone in pain. Sometimes mercy is the only medicine that works." Enclosed was a photograph. Gerda, standing in front of a small bakery, smiling, holding a tray of apple pies. She had baked again after all. The customer who entered now was young, perhaps 20, blonde hair, German accent. "1 cinnamon roll, please." Greta selected the best one, placed it in a paper bag. The girl opened it right there, took a bite. Her eyes widened. "This is wonderful. It tastes like my grandmother used to make, in Bavaria." "Bavaria," Greta repeated. "I'm from Bavaria, originally." "Really? Where?" "A small village. You wouldn't know it." The girl nodded. "The cinnamon is perfect." "How do you get it so right?" Greta smiled. "It's an old recipe, from someone who believed that flour needs love, that you must knead by hand, not by machine, that the dough knows the difference." The girl laughed. "That sounds like something my grandmother would say." Perhaps all grandmothers know the same secrets. The customer left. Greta watched her go. A young German woman in America, free, unburdened by history, able to taste a cinnamon roll and think only of her grandmother's kitchen. It was what all the struggle had been for, so that someday young people could taste sweetness without tasting sorrow. Greta returned to her work, but first she allowed herself a moment. She thought about the ship's hold, the first meal at Camp Aliceville, Brennan's hands kneading dough, Aldridge overcoming his grandfather's hatred, Gerda giving her the apple pie recipe. She thought about the first cinnamon roll, the one that had broken her open, the one that had tasted like her grandmother's kitchen. She thought about all the years since, the citizenship ceremony in 1952, the day Sophie finally joined her in Philadelphia, the daughters she had raised to know both languages, both histories. She had built a life from ruins, planted seeds in ash and watched them grow. On the wall behind the counter hung 2 framed recipes: Brennan's cinnamon rolls, Gerda's apple pie, side by side. American and German, captor and enemy, teacher and saboteur, both had given her something precious. Both had taught her about forgiveness. The bell chimed again. More customers. The morning rush. Greta tied her apron and returned to work. Outside, Philadelphia moved through its ordinary day. Inside, a woman who had once been an enemy stood in her own bakery, creating something beautiful from flour and butter and love. The dough knew the difference. It always had.